the United States Police Canine Association webinar Canine Policy, Changes that Reflect Best Practices and Reduce Liability. Our featured speaker is Scott Sargent. Scott is a 34-year law enforcement veteran and founder of Policing Solutions, which focuses on consultation with law enforcement agencies on the use of force and canine policing. Since 2018, Scott has worked as the project team member with the law firm of Manning and Cass to conduct management studies of canine units, including assessments of bite ratios, training, and policies to provide best practices-based recommendations for change. When Scott retired, he was the commanding officer of the LAPD Use of Force Review Division, responsible for adjudicating over 13,000 use of force incidents over 7 years, including categorical canine bites and over 500 officer-involved shootings. Scott revised the LAPD Canine Manual and drafted numerous LAPD force-related policies and tactical directives over the years. Scott is the author of Best Practices in Contemporary Canine Policing, which currently can be viewed on our homepage at www.uspca.com. I'd like to welcome Scott.
Thanks, Don. I appreciate the intro. I'm going to try to keep my the presentation to 20-25 minutes, no longer than 2-3 hours. I tend to over talk, but I'm going to set a timer, so we're going to see how that goes. That in the Starbucks, hopefully I can keep it in 20 minutes. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, this video, if people haven't seen it, this is the Michigan State Police canine bite that occurred not very long ago. What happened was the officers ended up getting criminally prosecuted. But let's go ahead and play it on silent if you can, without the volume. All right, this is at the end of it. Now, the reason we're playing this is not to critique the bite. No one's here to critique the bite. What I'm going to be talking about is, if you haven't seen this, by the way, you should take the time to pull it up on YouTube. It's on my webpage too, policing-solutions.com, with a lot of other videos. But the reason we're playing this video that ended up in felony charges being filed against a police officer is to demonstrate and talk about the disparity between the expectations of an officer who truly believes that they're carrying out the duties of the organization within course and scope, and what really is occurring when it comes to the end result. No officer should ever get filed on criminally for doing his job. Now, we're not talking about a clearly excessive force case where the vast majority of us would agree that the force is beyond Graham or department policy or even the law. We're talking about an entity in canine where officers are trained to do a certain thing. The expectations are set to do that thing. And then when they do it, they're either disciplined or they face charges in the law. So why don't you fast forward it up a little bit? This bite goes on for about 4 minutes. What happens is the handler is using the dog essentially as a force multiplier, as another officer, distracting the suspect until backup arrives. That's essentially what happens. The bite is almost 4 minutes long. So again, I'm not playing this to critique it, just to show that here's an officer who believes he's handling his dog based on his agency's expectations and training and policy, and then he gets criminally filed on. And that's not fair for anyone. It's not fair on the community. It's not fair for the officer. It's not fair for the organization. And here his backup arrives, and then the dog is out and put back in the car. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, let's talk about policy. We're going to talk about a policy development that's based on national best practices as best that we can determine them to be. Now, why is this important? Well, if we just start with the baseline, we don't want our officers to go to jail. We don't want lawsuits. Litigation is going up. Different types of qualified immunity is being reduced for police officers. The landscape is completely different. So for handlers, I know we have a mix of people listening, but for handlers, it means you need to know what the rules are when you're deploying. You really need to know concisely what these objective standards are. For the organization and for the entities, it's unfair to have officers go out and do police work and not know clearly what the rules are. Okay, next slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. We're going to talk about policy, and then we'll talk about some issues facing Canine today, and talk a little bit about what kind of things your organization can do to try to get in line with what's the best practice. Kind of keep in mind what those definitions are. So rules, policies are rules. Okay, they're not training standards, they're not tactics, they're not administrative guidelines, they're not records keeping requirements. They're fixed rules for how you get things done. They're flexible, but they're still hard. Basically, they are the hard rule for what police work is. There should always be exceptional and exigent circumstances built into these rules. So officers should always have flexibility and also be able to understand what the exceptions will be. It should be reviewed routinely. Okay, so you have policies. There's a hybrid of policies that I've seen. Some have never been changed, and they have 1972 dates on the bottom, and they've never evolved. And others are changed every time there's a drop of a hat. Every time some sergeant has an issue at a meeting, they revise the policy and change it. And so you can't have that either. You should have a regular revision process and review process annually where the policies are looked at, addressed, and revised. And lastly, all policies need to be understood by officers and supported with timely training. To issue policies in a mailbox or send them out or to post them up on a board and then hold people accountable for them, 2 hours after they've been pinned up on a board is not fair to police officers. There's a little bit of due process we have to consider when we're doing policies. We have to involve everyone in the conversation to change policies. And when we do change policy, everyone needs to be clear on what the definitions are, what the policy means, and they need to be timely trained on it. Okay, next slide. Okay, again, for reiteration, policy shouldn't be changed every day. So you have organizations also that, the policy is changing, and you'll see the date on the top of the policy, and it literally will change every couple of days, especially during a consent decree. I've been involved in a couple of consent decrees, and as soon as some input comes in, they're going to change the policy. What's best is that organizations to have a process to clarify the current policy. Notices can clarify it. Look, if you're not aware, this is what this particular policy means. This is the defined purpose of the policy and the intent of it. Training, there should be regular training on the policy and what it means. And special orders can be used. That's what we use in LA. Special orders are used for temporary changes in policy that can be incorporated later after review. But it's a temporary change of position on a particular thing until that's incorporated into the formal policy later. Training bulletins and directives, those aren't part of policy, but they're specific to the tactical conduct that you're carrying out in the field and not specific to the rule. You always have that basic guiding rule, and then you have basically the guidelines by which you carry it out. Okay, next. Again, tactics, don't confuse tactics. You can't tell in a policy how a building can be cleared, how officers should use the dog to clear a car. You can prohibit using a dog by clearing a car on a GTA stop in a policy, but you can't tell them how to do it if you're going to allow them to do it. The actual tactics used by officers need to be facilitated through training, and then there needs to be that openness to the decision-making process of officers. Again, training, you don't put training in policy because it's timely. It can be confidential, certain things, tactical training, SWAT training. These aren't policy. That it can be policy that the team completes a certain number of hours a year, and it should be in these particular areas from this particular vendor, but it shouldn't tell you exactly what the training is. Those are separate documents. Administrative guidelines that I mentioned in my article should be separate because they're not hard organizational operational rules. If they're not operational, they shouldn't be in the department's operational policy. They should be separated out. They can be in the same book. They can be in a separate manual, which is best. Where you keep the dog, what you feed the dog, where you take the dog to be taken care of, grooming standards, hours for the unit, things like that. And conflicting policy. Your policy should not conflict with the use of force policy or others. In fact, there should be a fairly even, consistent weaving between the policies, canine policy and use of force policy. I've seen several policies that either leave open use of force and leave it vague and just don't discuss it, or the deployment and directed application of the dog as a not force option conflicts with the department's use of force policy, or arguably it conflicts. And that should never be the case, because then again, you have, in most cases, everything will be fine, but you have cases where cops are going to jail. And it's not fair to officers to not know exactly what the rules are and exactly how they apply. Next policy, next slide. So every agency has a different process for writing policy. Here is an example where you're laying out a good format for policy. And the reason I'm covering this is because I've seen this format used where it completely changes around what's in here. Basically procedures are put in where definitions should be. There's oftentimes no definitions. It doesn't cover what's actually covered. The purpose is the reason. The scope is the what's covered. Procedures are the actual guidelines for carrying out the policy. So that's the meat of it. So the policy might be, canines can be, and we'll cover canine policy in just a minute. I actually have one up here. The canine can be used for a search and to apprehend suspects. Okay, that's the general policy. Procedures are how it's carried out. Then you start with, the responsibilities of the handler, responsibilities of supervisors, and then through the review process, command, lieutenants, captains, all the way down, all the way through adjudication. And then you have some clear organizational issues that can be part of policy, which is all bites shall be documented. A supervisor shall conduct a comprehensive review of bites in a post-bite assessment and give feedback. That can all be part of it as well. Okay, next slide. Well, let's talk about definitions. Most policies that I've reviewed don't have any definitions. Now, why is that important? Because everyone needs to be on the same page with what a particular rule is, what a law is, what is covered by policy. Policies need to be, if I were to leave you with one thing, policies need to be objective. They cannot be subjective. If they're subjective to interpretation, you're going to start to have problems. If 4 officers can interpret one policy 4 different ways and 2 get disciplined, 1 gets fired, and the other one was well within policy, and they all did the same thing, but it's articulated in a different way, and it's based on how they subjectively understood the rule, that's not fair to the officers, not fair to the organization, and it creates liability. Clear definitions tells the everyone who's reading it objectively what exactly that particular thing is that they're talking about. What is a directed bite? A directed bite is when the handler takes the dog and says, "Pock in, Foss, get him," whatever. That's a directed bite. When you have no conversation about what a directed bite is and a bite just happens, well, he was searching, the guy got bit, fast forward, everything's okay. Wait a minute. What kind of force did you have? Did you have a contact? What is clearly, what we're recommending is clearly defining what the bite is. This is force. Contact bite after a search. Dog searches, finds, a bite occurs based on the decision-making by the dog is one definition of the bite. Suspect flees from the car or is located and dog's called off. Suspect gets up and flees. Officer sends dog, deploys dog directly as a use of force. Officer is the decision maker, not the dog. two complete different things that should be talked about with Graham considerations and force and policy and deployment guidelines, and should be consistently defined within the policy. Again, exceptions and certain exigencies, everyone should know what that is. You can't start talking about, well, the search situation was exigent at the time. You need to be able to kind of define what that is. We'll talk about hard out, but it's just saying physical removal of the dog versus a call off of the dog from afar. Serious crime, real quick. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but serious crime. This needs to be talked about. So I think most of the policies that we've seen have something to the effect of dogs can be deployed when there is a serious crime. Search can be conducted when the suspect is believed to have committed a serious crime. Okay, what is a serious crime? How many states are y'all from? So we have a certain number of people here and a certain number of people listening from all across the country. What's a serious crime where you're from? What's a serious crime in your county, in your city, in your state? Completely different definitions. They're probably fairly consistent, but they're not exactly the same. So what do we mean by serious crime when we put that in a policy? And I've seen most policies have serious crime when the suspect's wanted for a serious crime. And what it is trying to put the definition under Graham within the policy, but in reality, you're confusing the canine handler. When you have serious crime, the handler now subjectively must determine what the serious crime is. He has to listen to the facts in his briefing before he deploys, and then he's going to deploy based on whether he believes there's a serious crime. So it's best to tell them what a serious crime is. How many of your agencies deploy a dog on a directed bite or a search for a GTA only, property crime only? Probably quite a few. And a lot of you probably leave it up to either the supervisor or their handler on scene to determine whether you should deploy the dog on the GTA, what the facts of the GTA were. That should not be the case. If it's a property crime GTA, you need to know whether to deploy the dog or not. I'm not saying one way or the other what you're going to do, but everyone needs to be clear on what a serious crime is, when a dog can be deployed. And the point is, these are why definitions are important in policy. Next slide. Okay, the world is changing. Canine is now a focus, as everyone knows. I think 2-3 people have been filed on in the past year or less. Everyone knows about the Stephanie Moore case in Maryland, where she was given a 10-year sentence for a dog bite. The fact, we're not speaking to the facts of the case or any of these cases, but things are changing and cops are going to get arrested and go to jail. This was not the case a long time ago. So we have one of two options. We can either just keep doing what we're doing and do what one of the unions said in the Washington Post article. The union said in response to a write-up they did on bites across the country and canine trends, problematic canine trends, and the Marshall Project, which covers bites across the country. One of the unions wrote in formally and said, they're just liberal trying to take away our dogs. Okay, what? That's not the way to respond. The way to respond is take a look at what we're doing and keep our people out of jail, not attack the media for covering what's happening. That's really not the way to do it. If everything we're doing is consistent with best practices, and we're able to stand up in court and talk about what we're doing and defend it, then absolutely what we're doing is God's work. You need to keep doing what you're doing. But everyone needs to step back, take a look at what we're doing, what the rules of engagement are for our organizations and for our cops, assess it, maybe modify it, make sure we're in the right place. Everyone in the organization is going in the right direction. We all concur, and then we're all locked on. Okay, but change is coming and change is here, and we need to make sure whether we're going to take care of our people. And handlers, you need to make sure that your organizations are taking care of you. Go through your policies and take a look. If any 3 people can interpret a policy in 3 different ways, 3 people get disciplined for it when 2 people do not, there's something wrong with the policy. Okay, next slide. Okay, if everyone hasn't noticed, I say that jokingly. I know everyone's noticed. Graham is changing. Graham was great. Graham was a great decision for us. It essentially made policy out of objective decision making and objective assessment for years and years and years and years and years. Graham was great. Most policies across the country merely injected Graham as the department's policy, and that worked. Well, things are changing. Graham might be the standard of policy for most organizations and for law. Now, which is not unusual for the Graham decision, it's a basic floor for use of force, for determining what is and what is not excessive force. It's a floor. So we've all been using the floor for many years, and now the walls are starting to get built. That's probably the best analogy. Graham is changing. So it was objective reasonableness, right? Similar training, similar facts, no 20/20 hindsight, which was our goal, that no 20/20 hindsight. Don't question us. Well, that's not the way it works anymore, because reasonably, courts and agencies are saying, yeah, we have a right to look back and determine what's best for our organization and for our community. And we have a right to ask a little bit more than just what if the officer himself or herself thought the force was reasonable, which is what we were doing. That officer thought it was reasonable, therefore it was reasonable if we think that their thinking was right. Now it's changed. Now we have some subjective components that are being inserted into Graham across the country. It's not the law has changed Graham in some respects during case law in different places, but the reality is now we have terms like necessary in mostly for deadly force cases, which is more Garner, but we have decision-making stuff. We have whether it was necessary or not. Now, necessary is subjective, right? What's necessary for you might not be necessary for me. Proportionality. Okay, these are the two important ones, proportionality and de-escalation. Proportionality means that, which is a concept that's being put into policy across the country, similar to and almost interchangeably with de-escalation. Proportionality means that if the suspect is resisting this much, the officers can use force enough to overcome that resistance, right? But when the suspect's resistance goes down, the force should subjectively and objectively go down. Same with de-escalation. De-escalation is more from the beginning. What did you do to prevent it from occurring? What did you do to try to talk them into custody, to verbalize and do all these things before you used force? And when you used force, was it at an escalation? Did you escalate the force consistent with the suspect's actions? Okay, that's really a little bit away from Graham. Graham was basically a wheel. Spin it, whatever the decision is to do it, we assess that decision at the time. Now we're almost going back to the stairs. Remember the stairs where we had a continuum where we had to start with verbalization if it was reasonable to do that. We're kind of going back there. And while your policy may not say it now, if you read my article, under Trump, the Department of Justice not long ago put out a executive order basically telling agencies you need to start talking about de-escalation and training de-escalation. If you don't have it yet, you're going to have it soon. So these are concepts that you need to take into consideration when you're developing and assessing your policy. Okay, next. Okay, where do you start? Best practices is essentially what you're going for. There's no reason why your agency, doesn't matter how big or how small, cannot be the absolute best and the model, the professional model for canine policing in your region or in your state. And that's done through policy and training. Okay, determine what's a best practice policy for your organization. It's consistent with community expectations, with your organizational leadership's expectations, the government entity, the county, the city's expectations, and a best practice according to the highest level of the state of training in canine across the country. Now we'll talk about it a little bit more. I talk more in my article, but That doesn't mean going to every seminar and bringing back every, maybe, never heard of canine procedure and bringing it back to your organization. It means consistent application of best practices that are practiced across the country. And here's the definition for best practices in police canine. You can read that. It's on my website too. You can use it if you want. So let's talk about where to go when we're talking about changing policy or looking at assessing policy. Next slide. Okay, these are just a kind of an overview of things that you can keep in mind. You can have a copy of this PowerPoint too, so you can follow it if you want to. It's certainly nothing's mandatory, nothing's required, and there's nothing mandated by law in here or anything else. But it's just some things that might help you as you're moving along, trying to keep your folks out of trouble. So you should start with a plan. If this can be one cop, I know small departments. I've worked for several small departments. Small departments will assign one person to do that. We'll assume one officer to handle everything. To develop a plan to look at the policy or the policies. And if you're looking at canine policy, you should look at use of force policy and any others that are covered by force or that are similar. Conduct an assessment, an honest assessment. If anyone in the room says everything's fine, don't worry about it, we don't need to change anything, you need to take another look, because that is a common mantra for police: is we're fine. If a lawsuit or a federal court doesn't order us to change, we're not going to change. We've been fine for years. We're just going to keep doing what we're doing. Oh, but don't put it on camera. Whatever you do, don't activate your cameras. Okay, why not activate your camera? We'll talk about that in a minute, but why, if everything's fine, why not activate your body cameras? And we'll talk about that. But you should never hide from your police work from cameras. It's like surgery. It's not pretty, but it's happening, and you can explain to the public why you're doing it. Anyway, back to this slide. Identify areas where you should change. Some things you should think about. Do some research. Take a look at what's best in a particular area. Develop and revise policies. Get feedback from officers and for personnel. Get input from personnel. And then when you develop and sign those policies, you should have clear written guidelines, and then they should be reviewed and make sure that they're clear and objective. And a good way to do it is you throw a policy into a room and you see how many different people can come up with a different outcome for the same policy. And you do that until there's only one outcome for that policy. And then it becomes objective. That's when there's one objective standard to apply. And then when you do it, you train to that standard, you follow up, and you retrain as needed. Okay, next. Okay, example. I'm going a little over, but I'm going to kind of power through unless I get a big thumbs down from everybody. This is an example of an effective canine policy. Okay, here you're prioritizing search with a secondary focus on apprehension. It doesn't put one over the other, but it prioritizes what your dogs are used for. Again, this is just a sample policy. You can kind of consider this or don't, but it just explains how the policy consideration works here. So the canine is used. The purpose and scope is basically, this policy is to govern police canine. That's the purpose and scope. Policy is to track and locate missing persons and contraband, and consistent with this policy, and you can even put it in with all policies or with the use of force policy, to search for and apprehend criminal suspects. Okay, that's the policy for the organization here. The policy is we use the dog as a priority to search, which is really what you do anyway. And then secondarily, a secondary consideration is the dog used as an apprehension mode. In litigation, in a deposition, in court, it sounds good to say this dog is used to find people. This is what we use them for. Well, don't you use them to bite? Isn't it, use of force? Well, yes, but the primary purpose of our dogs is to assist personnel and in conducting searches. And then yes, the dog can be used for apprehension, either in contact mode or in apprehension mode, directed apprehension mode, whatever is necessary at the time. So you can kind of see how policy can really change an organizational dynamic, the appearance of it when you go to court, what it actually means when they put it on a whiteboard and you have to explain it. It's not, when you have policies that say canine can be used to apprehend or to search, period, that's not a policy that's really best practices anymore. We need to be a little bit more focused on what we're using our tools for. Every aspect of police work is basically the same. We're having to hone down a little bit more, be a little bit more consistent with what we're doing with objective standards. And this is an example of that. Okay, next. I'm going to talk about a few things that have been coming up that we've seen and that are issues of the day. And I think everyone would agree where we're going through. Now, how you resolve or talk about this can be everything from we're fine to, yeah, we're going to reassess the way we do A, B, and C, these operational issues. Here's just some conversation for you to take back with you to talk about how you're doing police work. Do you need to assess your policy or look at it, or do you not? Okay, you've had long enough to read. So this is a big one. In certification, you train to call off, right? You have to certify. Certify, you call the dog off. You know, boost out, here, whatever. Dog comes back to you. In the field, do you do that? Have you ever done it? Not you, but do handlers do that? Do they routinely do that? Or do they always hard out? Do they always physically remove the dog on a bite? I'm not saying one way or the other is any, you know, is what you should or shouldn't do, but what's your default tactic? Because in litigation, I think attorneys will agree. Gene would agree. I think this comes up. They'll simply ask, what is your default? What do you do? What are you trained to? Why are we trained to out, call off on an out? Well, do you do that ever? Did you do it here? The guy had his hands up and yelled, okay, 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 okay. We see it on an NBC video from the store, yet you left him on while you formulated a tactical plan, approach, and you took the suspect into custody. Okay, for a minute. Or you used the dog as a distraction or for a force multiplier while you waited for backup. So you basically continued force during a particular window of time. I am not saying to do one way or the other. I'm just saying know what your default tactics are, how they're written in policy. If there's no policy at all or tactical guidelines on it, you may want to talk about this particular issue because, again, this is all about the evolution of force, how it's changing, and how you want to keep your folks out of trouble. Remember, you're going to be, at some point, you're probably going to end up using de-escalation, proportionality, and reasonableness. So when you're leaving a dog on for 3 minutes, would you continue to tase the person for 3 minutes? Would you continue to poke them with a baton to keep them on the ground for the 3 minutes after they're yelling, okay, okay? Now, I'm only using extreme examples because those are the only ones that kind of arise. But when we look at policies, oftentimes these are just not addressed. In training, they're not addressed, or there's tremendous conflict between the two. Okay, next slide. Similar issue. The duration of the bite. Again, same thing. Dog left on while we decide to formulate a tactical plan over here. Who knows, he could be armed is oftentimes the case. If, in fact, he is armed and it needs to be articulated well while you're continuing to use the force that you're using, the duration of the should be documented, how long it was on. It should be on video. Your force should be on body camera. There's no reason. This is still a tough sell. Eventually, everybody will be on department camera. It's better for, and I'll talk about this real quick later, but I'll talk about it now. It's better for you to control the message, you to control your policies, you to control how your policies worked with what happened, and do it with your chin up and have the policies to hand out to whoever wants to see it, and you have no problem with what you did. When agencies shut off the camera, which I see a lot, they get up and somebody yells, cameras, and all the cameras go off, or they forget to leave one camera off, and it's the only one that stays on, and it conflicts with what everyone else had said about it, or it's caught by a camera crew or by a civilian on the side that's filming it, and everyone had a camera and they turned them off, or the department decides not to issue cameras to specialized units because it's too expensive, or they just really prefer not to have them issued to everybody. If you don't have cameras now, you eventually will. You need to basically embrace the camera for what it can give you. I can tell you that in LA, it has been a godsend, and we hated them. LAPD wanted nothing to do with cameras. It was going to be the downfall of law enforcement. But in fact, that is not what happened. In fact, we now have documentation about what we do and how we do it, and we merely explain why we did it. And we have not seen the personnel complaints come in and the lawsuits and the units being destroyed because of camera. None of that happened. Actually, when people acted a fool or made complaints that weren't justified, it was all on camera. Cameras have been much more of a godsend than a problem for us, and that's in LA. Okay, next slide. Okay, these are the other issues. Body cameras, the one I really wanted to touch on. If you don't have them, if they're coming your way, and you hear people saying no, never, I don't want them, get them away from us. They're really not not even nearly as bad as you think they'll be. And will it cause you to be a little bit more professional and follow the rules a little bit more when you're on camera? Yeah, you'll probably want to have, but what it'll also do is show you where there's issues that need to be fixed. Shutting the camera off is not going to do it. You need to have that. Real quick, a couple things I know I'm over. Organizational leadership. Who runs your unit? Who runs your canine unit? Is it the handlers? Is it one handler? Is it a sergeant? Is it a sergeant that cares about canine? Is it a lieutenant? Does anyone run it? I know every place I've worked, it's been a part-time sergeant who ran it, who had no interest in canine, didn't work the same shift, had no interest, didn't go to training. If that sounds familiar, you may want to have your organization take a look at what's going on with that. Who's your chief trainer? A chief trainer should not be the contract guy who imports the dog and does basic training. That's not his responsibility. Is not to do your operational training. You should have a chief trainer who trains consistent with law and policy for your organization and expectations, and can train to officer tactics. Your trainer your contract trainer who brought dogs in from Germany or from wherever is not that guy, because he's operating with 12 different agencies or 20 different agencies across the region of the country. And his job is not to train tactics and such. His job is to train basic canine handling skills. So you need to look at that gap between when you bring the dog in and what's going on now in between there and certification. There's a lot going on that you need to pay attention to. Internal assessment, make sure you're paying attention and documenting training and deployments. Post-bite assessment means every bite should be assessed. Every bite should have a formal assessment and a write-up done to show where you can make improvements in the future. Okay, I think I'm over already, I know, and I'll leave it up if there's questions or whatever, and you can feel free to contact me on my website, policing-solutions.com, and there's videos and stuff there and conversations, or engage in any conversation you have. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate that. Next, we have a speaker. We'd like to introduce Dr. David Furland. Lou to most. He was a police officer with the 110 person Portsmouth, New Hampshire Police Department for 30 years, finishing his career as chief of police. Professor Furland consults and presents college-level criminal justice courses, was the National Executive Director of the United States Police Canine Association, is a nationally certified police canine trainer, evaluator, and previous head trainer of the New Hampshire Police Canine Academy for 10 years. Dr. Furland is a highly rated public speaker, police canine subject matter expert, published author, and teacher on leadership issues, criminal justice, public policy, police history. He has received many awards, both locally and nationally. Lou?
Well, good afternoon for those on the East Coast, and good morning for those on the West Coast. Thank you, Don, for that wonderful introduction. And Scott, I definitely love your presentations. Thank you. I always learn something from them. when we were putting these presentations together, what we wanted to do was to have a format where we had 20, 25 minutes of a primary speaker, and then 4 other people coming in to talk about the same topic, but perhaps from a different perspective, or perhaps from a different look, but still the same topic. And so, we wanted to talk about these things first off because we're seeing cops getting arrested, and we're seeing Canine having an incredible focus placed upon it. And quite honestly, Scott's seen the videos. He showed you one. We're seeing videos from the body cameras or from civilians that, we're looking at, and it's kind of hard to justify under their policies because the policies aren't written very well. So we wanted to talk about different things. And I know that we're all coming from different jurisdiction and different sizes. And, but there's lots to be learned from someone from LAPD or Seattle or NYPD, merely because they have so many more examples. I come from probably a similar size agency from you guys. I come from 110 cops, and, we're not 2,500 cops, 25,000 cop type of organizations. So we need to make sure that we're learning from these other organizations that are going through these examples, because sooner or later they're going to touch upon us. So let's all have some sort of sharing going on, because there's a lot that we can learn from each other. So anyway, listen, my job now is a professor, and as a professor, we like to go over things to make sure that we revisit and have the bullet points in our notebook. So some of the takeaways that I took from Scott's presentation was, one of the things was train the policy, meaning that just don't write a policy, but make sure that everybody knows about the policy and make sure everybody understands what the policy means. And that's an important part. It's nice to have a policy, but if an officer doesn't understand what you actually meant by that policy, well, there's a communication breakdown then. And you're not going to have the performance on the street as a supervisor that you expected. And you want to make sure, another takeaway, that the canine policy matches the use of force policy, or at least the canine is in the use of force policy somewhere, so that there's some parameters as to how the dog is going to be used or not used as a use of force option. And then I like the slide where he had the definition, so that we're all talking about the same things. We're all on the same page when we talk about, contact bites and things of that nature. And I also liked his recommendation or his support for body cameras, because that's where it's going, gang. The industry is going there. You're better to get there sooner rather than later. So those were my bullet point takeaways. And Scott had many more in there, but those were my bullet point takeaways. And we got other speakers that can talk about perhaps their takeaways. And I'm sure you have your own. But I wanted to augment a couple things, and I wanted to provide my perspective on this issue of policy. And I know that there's a whole technical part of writing policy, and that's not what this is about. This is about what a canine policy should and should not have, perhaps. And what I like to see in policy, not just canine policy, but what I like to see in policy is sometimes examples of exactly what you mean to permit. Do you mean to permit the dog to be used in an off-lead search of a building? And if you don't expect them to perform that way, then you need to limit the policy saying that you can't do that. So let me go over that again. You need to be able to explain or provide examples of what you expect to use the dog for. Scott mentioned it's primarily a search tool. It's secondary use of force option. Great. Okay, now let's move that on. So you're going to permit the dog to be a search tool. What kind of a search tool is it going to be used for? Give a couple examples. Make it crystal clear with your communication what you expect the dog to be doing. Conversely, you need to be able to limit what you want the dog to do. For example, do you want to not allow the dog to do civilian crowd control? Or are there times when you're going to allow the dog team to be involved in civilian crowd control or demonstrations? Give an example. Put some parameters on your policy. You can do this. I expect you to do this. I don't expect you to do that. And if you're faced with something that is not permitted or not within, you definitely need to contact the supervisor if time allows to make sure you're deploying your dog properly before you go outside of what's expected in the policy. If your canine policy doesn't have these things, then what you need to do is you need to ask for clarification. And I suggest you ask for clarification via like email or some sort of document. Because, you're going to get trained. I'm talking to the handlers now. You're going to get trained to do many things at the dog academy. And your boss may not really want you to be deploying the dog in that capacity. And you need to figure out what your department expects you to do with your dog. Because if you're falling outside of policy, or if you're falling outside of expectations, guys, we're seeing cops getting arrested. So we need to make sure that we're operating within certain parameters, and leaders, managers, bosses out there, you need to make sure that you're writing good policy, that you're putting your expectations out clearly. You're putting some limitations in, saying, I don't expect you to go this direction. I mean, if you have just a search dog and you're going after armed people on your search dog, well, provide a little bit of clarity there as to what you really expect that dog handler to do and what kind of backup that dog handler might want to have. We're not going to talk about tactics. We're just talking about the call itself, and provide some good clarity as to what you really want your dog team to do. Now, I tried to keep it short because I know Scott went over a little bit. We're trying to stay on time. So, Don, I will defer the rest of my time to the next speaker. Thank you, gang.
Thanks, Lou. Appreciate that. Our next speaker is Steve White, who is the sergeant trainer for the Seattle Police Department Canine Unit. Steve is the only person to have served as a handler, trainer, training sergeant, and commander for the Washington State's largest police canine unit. He has so much information here. He has trained in 15 countries. He specializes in behavior problem solving, tracking, and scent work through the use of positive reinforcement-based operant conditioning. He is the author of the Canine Training Principles for the Modern Operating Environment, which is currently can be viewed on our homepage at uspca.com. Steve, you're on.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Don. I'm going to try and live up to it. Scott's presentation gave me so many things to think about in this. Coming from a trainer's perspective, this topic really makes the distinction between the loop end of the leash and the clip end of the leash apparent. Because you ask anybody who's a trainer here, and I can see faces I recognize in the list of attendees who are dog trainers, canine trainers. They'll tell you the clip end is the easy piece. Working with the dog is the easy part of this. The hard part of the task is training them to be effective dog handlers. And the only way that's going to work is if they have clarity about where they're going to go. And so this presentation, if you take anything from this as a trainer, it is to take the policy and get it as clear as you possibly can. And if the policy itself isn't clear, you get clarification from your chain of command. And also, you figure out how will it affect you. And the tendency we normally have, people, human beings is to straw man an argument. In other words, well, you come up with this and then you build an argument against your the position you're going to have, and you straw man it. You make it weak so you can tear it down quickly. What we need to do is actually steel man the arguments against us. We have to presume that those who are going to scrutinize us are going to do it with, the harshest lens possible. They're going to do it with the most rigorous methods possible. And we must apply that rigor in our training and in our examination of what we do. I know because I've made the mistake of not doing that. And that, for me, is the lesson that every outcome, whether it's good or bad, whether you liked it or didn't, provides valuable information about how you can proceed moving forward. You decide whether you're going to affirm the action or you're going to go ahead and make adjustments moving forward from that point. Scott made the distinction between policy and tactics. Understand that they are inexorably wed. If your tactics are antithetical to your department policy, you're going to run into trouble. And conversely, if you just build a policy, but then you don't build tactics to support it, you'll fall apart there. So you always have to keep an eye on the adjustments that policy asks you to make. My own department just recently issued a whole bunch of policy changes that are forthcoming. We're looking at them and we're going to say, okay, how are these going to affect how we do business? That is the responsible thing we have to do. And giving your handlers clarity about what they're going to do. When we first started, it was for any crime. Then it was serious crimes. And then we had to go through it. So like Scott read our history as we found out that actually that kind of specificity about what a serious crime is was needed, because it's subject to interpretation. You can have different people looking at it in different ways. And I think one of the things that's going to happen is you're going to see that the necessary and proportional hinges of examining use of force are going to become more and more important as we move forward from this. The Graham standard is going to wind up being modified, if not by courts, then by industry standard, by practice, as proportionality and necessity become the linchpins for examining use of force. That's going to put departments in a kind of a quandary as how they defend it, because the courts are still using primarily the Graham standard, but it's still, that's the operating environment, and industry standards are what we're going to be judged by. And I want to touch on the notion of liability exposure. Anybody who's been a canine handler knows that, yes, our dogs are primarily a search tool. They are primarily there to use their nose to do something. They're the only tool in the inventory that will literally drag us to a confrontation with the suspect. And we know that liability exposure is really a reflection of risk exposure, officer safety risk, risk to the public, and risk to the suspect himself. When you take that stew of those three types of risk and put them together, liability goes up if the risk goes up. And so everything you can do to improve officer safety, public safety, and suspect safety should help reduce your liability risk. The one temptation when you say that is to do nothing. And you got to teach people how to operate in a way that you are not just doing nothing, because that isn't going to solve the problem. You still need to figure out how you can remain actionable in the operation. And training your dogs to give you poise while the officers do police work in that moment is critical. Having the dog not get in the way of somebody who has to do police work at that moment is absolutely essential. So working on stability is one of the things as a trainer you're going to want to build in. And I think the last thing I want to touch on is I saw an interesting question or two in the QA come up. And that is, what do you do when you have a weak or poor policy? And again, I can speak from personal experience that misunderstanding a policy is a path to all sorts of heartache. And so one of the things that I would say is, if you suspect that your policy isn't clear, with everything in your heart being pure and honest about this, go to your chain of command and say, look, we need clarity on this. You're asking canine officers to go out there and act as point and pull people towards confrontation with suspects. We need clarity about how we're going to handle the end of that activity. And if you can't get that, then steelman it. Take what your existing policy is, what your existing tactics are, and examine both as if you were the most harsh critic in the world, sitting in a courtroom, sitting in the council chambers, criticizing what's going on, and then adjust your training accordingly. Train for the worst possible sort of scrutiny you're going to have, and then with any luck, you can actually help your department drive that, because you will be part of that rising tide that will raise all boats. I really have nothing further to say other than I really appreciate Scott's presentation on this. It's something that, I've looked at this, and having gone through the process through the past few years of seeing things evolve, I think he's giving us a roadmap for the canine industry as a whole to help us kind of take the lead for the entire law enforcement community. But the first responsibility for those of us in this group is to take care of our canine brothers and sisters and make sure that we're out there doing the best we can. And the only way to do that is train And when you're not training, you still train, because anytime you're with your dog, one of you is training the other. And if you aren't the trainer, then by gosh, you are the trainee. And so you have to eat, breathe, and sleep this. And supervisors, you have to give handlers the opportunity to train in that manner. So that's the end of my piece on this. I'll kick it back to you, Don.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate your thoughts. Next, we have Gene Ramirez. He is a founding member of Manning and Cass, Elrod, Ramirez, and Truster. He serves as an advisor to several public entities on the issues of use of force, canine, and SWAT issues. He has provided training to thousands of police officers and supervisors from around the country. He is the general counsel for the United States Police Canine Association and the California Association of Tactical Officers. He regularly speaks to chiefs of police organizations on liability and supervision issues. Gene?
Well, good morning or afternoon, depending where you are. I'm going to talk about 3 real points and then let you all get back to your lives. I will also point out that I'm going to be speaking in more detail next Wednesday for USPCA Region 12. I'll be there all day speaking, so you could either reach out to Steve Pearson, who I know is part of this group today, or Paul Biederman. And I'm looking forward to spending 8 hours with handlers and supervisors outside Minneapolis next week. So Scott did a great job. Take advantage of the policy that he has provided to you. Agencies have spent thousands, and I mean thousands of dollars for us to come in and evaluate their canine units, and they get that policy. So take advantage of it. Number 2, a lot of people are using third-party vendors to purchase their policies, and that's a great idea in many ways, but you need to spend the time going over it section by section to make sure it applies to your particular agency, whatever peculiarities your agency might have. If you're not clear about the definitions, reach out to the provider and say, we need to change this, or we need to address this issue, because that policy is either going to save you in a lawsuit or it's going to sink you. You get to decide what's going to happen. So I know one of the policies that's out there by a vendor talks about a department's going to have training, yearly training assessments. How many people really do that? But a savvy attorney is going to find that and ask that agency, wait, I'd like to see proof that you're doing these yearly training assessments. And if it doesn't exist, they already have you on a violation of policy, and it just snowballs from there. So take the time to review those written policies to make sure that they comport with what your agency wants. Number 2, you should have one operative policy that all handlers and supervisors work under. You're probably thinking, God, Gene, you think we're crazy? We're going to have like multiple policies? Crazier things have happened. When I first started doing canine litigation back in 1990s, I was representing a very large organization. And when I first went in there with the captain, who was just recently transferred there to take over, I asked the handler, I'd like to see your policy. Basic question. He pulls it out and says, here it is. And it had a certain date on it. And then another handler looked at it and said, well, wait, that's not the policy I have. He goes to a desk, pulls out a completely different policy and said, well, this is what I'm operating under. So this does happen. It has happened. And I don't ever want you to go through that, because let me tell you, my blood pressure went up quite high that day, and it's never come back down, but that's another story. So make sure you have one operative policy that everybody can know that is the policy. You train to that policy and everybody understands it. Number 3, we all established that we have to have a policy. We all have that written policy. It's in our cards. It's in our offices. We all know our policy. Let's talk about the unwritten policies, but that's what's going to also get you in trouble. A lot of agencies have their quote, this is the way we do it. This is ex-police department's way of policing. I'm a little concerned about that. There's a famous case called Kerr versus City of West Palm Beach, Florida. And it talked about, on its face, the canine policy of West Palm Beach, Florida is one of the best that I have ever seen. We're only going to go after serious felony suspect. We're going to give canine announcements. We're going to take photos when the bite. I mean, line by line, it was a really solid policy. But they had an oral policy that allowed them to deploy in any serious misdemeanor suspect. And the handlers are going, okay, all right, serious misdemeanor suspect. Hey, Sarge, how do you define a serious misdemeanor suspect? The answer given was basically anything you want it to be. Violating city ordinances, walking in the park after dark. Well, the handlers are going, it's about time. So they went out and started deploying. one of the other unwritten, not so much a policy, but it was more of a practice or custom of West Palm Beach, Florida, was every time you got a canine bite, you got to put a little star on the side of your car door. When you got 50 or more bites, you got a really big star. You look like a World War I flying ace. Now, a lot of you played high school or college football. And what did you play for? The decal on the helmet. And when you saw someone get a decal, that's going to cause you to go out there and work harder and be more aggressive so you can get a decal. Well, this is the same thing. That kind of a policy, unwritten, or a custom, you get rewarded every time you get a bite, is going to cause handlers to go out there and get bites, some of them unwarranted. And with an oral policy deviating from the written policy that you get to deploy, basically anybody you want to can get bitten, that's going to create the lawsuits. More importantly, as we've already heard today, it's not going to create the lawsuit, it's going to create criminal cases. And we're trying to prevent people from going to prison because we're seeing so-called progressive DAs throughout the country actively coming after law enforcement officers. And use of force is a huge topic. We're seeing it in Minneapolis with the Chauvin case and around the country. I don't want any handler, any supervisor, any law enforcement officer to go to prison because they didn't know what the policy was or they were allowed to get around that policy. We're trying to protect you. So with that, because I know we're out of time, if anybody has any questions, please reach out to us. But I wish you all the best. Be safe out there. Scott, Steve, Lou, great job. Don, thank you very much for inviting me.
Thanks, Gene. I know quite a few people have raised their hand. I'd like to recognize someone before we go to questions. Another key member of this team that you've seen today so far is John Kerwick. He's recently retired as commanding officer of the MTA Police Department Special Operations Division in New York City, which is also the largest explosive detection canine unit in the United States. He is not speaking today, but he is an integral part of this team, so I want to recognize him as for his value, and he will be speaking next time. So we have some questions. Doug Roller has raised his hand twice, so and somebody else just did too. So what we'd like to do is have you type them out, so we don't know how everybody's speaking arrangements are going to work here, whether they work or they don't. Are you guys okay with that? I don't know who you are. So, I see Doug. Let's go to Doug if you can do it. Are you typing it?
Yes.
Okay, why don't you type it? We'll go to another question. Question is what can a handler do to help protect themselves when they realize they have a weak or poor policy? And I think Gene might have just answered that, and so did Steve. But anybody?
I'll take a shot at it real quick. I would just say to protect yourself, be conservative interpreting the policy. What you'll probably find is that if you have a weak policy, you defer to a supervisor who's not experienced, doesn't have the competence to run a canine unit. Let's say you're a 12-year handler and you call a sergeant who's got 4 years on, who is your canine sergeant. I think a lot of people can identify with that. And you ask his opinion. You can get that tacit approval on the policy, or you can just make a conservative decision on your own. You have a misdemeanor who is grabbing his waistband and runs, or do you have an armed suspect? What do you have? You're being asked to make the decision, and most likely your sergeant is probably not experienced, and he's going to shrug and say whatever you think. So the decision is back on you. So, it's be conservative in how you interpret it. I don't want to say don't do what you think is best, but you do what's best and what you're trained consistently under that policy. But, other than that, you just and make sure your supervisors are held accountable. If you're calling a sergeant to the scene to make a decision and they defer to you every single time, that's a conversation between the sergeant and the command. Is that we have supervision and leadership to provide supervision and leadership. If every time we ask Sergeant Jones what to do, or can you clarify on the approval of this bite, and he just shrugs and drives away, that's not helping us. We need the sergeant speaks for management. So you have to make sure that the supervisors are held accountable. That's probably a little bit too much, but in the end, you want to make sure policy is clear and changed. But otherwise, you have to protect yourself, and you don't want to get into trouble like this. Or Michigan guy who thought he was following policy, and now everyone's like, oh no, he was outside of policy. But I hope that kind of adds to it.
I would also recommend documenting that. If you have a problem with the policy, document it, send it up your chain of command. So if something happens, you, the handler, are protected, because it's up to supervision to take a look, say, wait, maybe we should reevaluate this policy. It's like if you're not allowed to go to training because you're on minimums, this happens over and over again. You've got to document that I asked to go to training, was not allowed to, and your supervision is going to be responsible for why they didn't respond. So it goes all the way up the chain of command.
Thank you, gentlemen. Another question: is requiring ARs for an open air sniff best practice or detrimental? I don't know what ARS means, so if anybody knows. Okay, here's another one. In California, we have you have to report significant uses of force to DOJ through URSUS. Would you define a canine apprehension as great bodily harm or significant injury? And what has been your experience? Good question.
Yeah, there is a huge debate right now, and California Post just recently came out with a definition of force that our office objected to, because it was using what we thought was a different definition that we thought was better. And so Post has now changed it. It depends on the severity of the injury. If it's just a simple puncture or a rake, that may not be significant. If there are stitches involved, it may go up the ladder, it may not. And of course, if death occurs, which again is very, very rare, that would take it to a whole new level. So it's going to depend. If the dog broke a bone, that may be considered significant. So that is a definition that we're all fighting over as to which do we use. Do we use, Scott, I think in your definitions in your policy, you use the FBI's definition, or something similar.
I would recommend. I hate to play big agency guy, but I would recommend you look at. I've got some policies you can look at, or LAPD's policy defines separates the bite into just a non categorical, we call it bite, or a categorical use of force, which raises the level. When you define it like that, you clearly state what level of force it is. So if you have a bite where the dog is nipped and taken down, and he's treated and booked, then that's not going to be significant, great bodily injury or significant force. But there are times when you're going to have that. You could have a guy die. When I was a handler back in the 80s, I had a brachial artery severed, and the guy bled out in the scene, and they brought him back. But it was just a bite, but that caused his death. But that would have been the next level. So whatever, maybe you're putting that up in the officer-involved shooting, where you use great bodily, your force results in great bodily injury. You're just classifying it so that it gets a greater level of scrutiny and consideration. So in answering the question, it depends on the department policy. If it's not clear, it should be written into the policy. What do those things mean?
I'm going to touch on a question that Doug Roller put into the chat here. And I gave a short answer. Doug said, please speak to the mindset of chasing the bite. Sees it all over the country. Placing the bite on the suspect as an apprehension and compliance tool has been way overused. Scott Sargent sums it up that these are primarily search tools, secondarily apprehension tools. And my response is, if you take a look at the dog's value, what they bring to the department, their primary irreplaceable value is as a tool that finds people and things. There's nothing else in the inventory that can do it. As a tool of force, they have a couple of main advantages. One is a dog is arguably a little more expendable than a human being. Every police supervisor would rather console a handler on the loss of a dog than a spouse on the loss of an officer. That said, there are still circumstances in which you can't even consider that dog an expendable tool. It's not appropriate. The other real advantage they have is, for some people, the dog poses a psychological deterrent. You may get somebody who would willingly fight with a guy the size of Doug Roller in his uniform, but will think twice about it with a dog. Not everybody, because the very first bite I had as a canine handler, as a military police canine handler, was somebody who just wanted to see how hard the dog bit, and he didn't care. He didn't pose anything other than that. That was his, again, that was 44 years ago. Now, in the long run, when you look at the dog's other primary advantage, and that is it's the only tool that can either stop or change course once it's deployed towards its target, there's a real advantage there, because you can take some of the issues of backdrop out of the way that come in handy. But for the most part, anything a dog can do, we have other tools that can do bigger, better, faster, harder. So we have to break the mindset that the bite is the tantamount piece of the work for the dog. The thing to focus on is that the scent work is what the dog brings to the department that nothing else we have can do. And that is a culture piece. And individual canine units have their cultures. My unit has a culture that's very different from a unit on the opposite side of my state. And you have to decide how you're going to go ahead and change that culture. You try to unify it, but the big thing you have to do is, as Scott talks about, look at where the policy is. I don't think you'll go wrong, or I'll put it this way. It's controversial and it's restrictive in many ways, but if you look at agencies that have gone through the DOJ process, get a hold of one that is get a hold of their policies and see what has passed muster, what's handled the scrutiny at that level, and then see what you can do to tweak your policy and your tactics accordingly. And here's the thing is, it's a moving target. Just when you think you got it dialed in right, something will happen outside the scope of way the policies are crafted, and you will have to adjust what you're doing. It is a never-ending process. You are in continual pursuit of improvement through this. The work is never done. Just like training your dog is never done, you are never done trying to tweak what you do in accordance to policy. And in the end, it always comes to training. Everything will fall back to training, because the policies aren't useful if you don't train to them. And the tactics won't work if you don't train them. So in the end, training is the pivot point between those two that you've got to continually keep at. And you got to always go through that self-critical examination and come up with what needs to be tweaked next. Back to you.
Okay, Haley has come back and said that she has wants to know if you need a articulable, reasonable suspicion in order to run a dog in an open air sniff. Would anybody like to take that one? And I think what she wants to know is, can you just take your dog and let it go to find the freshest human scent, or do you have to have an idea that somebody's there? I don't know if that's true or not.
Hey, this is Haley. Can I ask my question real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So our department requires it for narcotic searches. Our felony searches and person searches are way different. But the Supreme Court doesn't require it, but our policy does require it. So I'm just curious, is it detrimental or is it best practice to have the ARS for the narcotic search?
Go ahead, Lou.
So I can start with this, and I know we have a couple lawyers on the panel already, so I'd be interested to hear from them. But listen, well, first off, you got to follow policy unless it's illegal or unethical. You need to follow your department policy, and it requires it. So, but that doesn't answer your question. The question is, is it best practice to require that type of further threshold in order to deploy your dog? Because you don't need to have that threshold. It's one that's the department has placed further upon you before you start deploying the dog. And I would wonder, first off, from the administrator's point of view, why they put that furtherance upon you. Why are they making that requirement on the dog team when it's not necessary as far as the very minimum that the federal court system has authorized to do? And I would suspect that there's some sort of story behind inclusion in the policy itself. So first, my first advice is to make sure you follow that policy. No matter what you hear on this panel, no matter who tells you what, it's your policy, and that's the rules that you need to be able to operate under. Now, as far as the best practices, I'm not going to say it's not, because if I did, then I would be going against the creators of your policy and your bosses, and I think that would be very bad form for me from afar to be able to make that judgment upon the policy that you are operating under with in your department that might have some very unique circumstances that cause that policy to be created, cause that wording in the policy to be created. So that's my best advice I can give you, is make sure you follow the policy. And I really don't have another answer for you, because I just don't know all the facts behind why the bosses put that in the policy.
I will just point out that I don't handle narcotics cases, because very rarely are you getting sued over a bad search. However, the Supreme Court sets like the floor. You cannot go below that, but others are free to make it above, more stringent. For example, Graham versus Garner sets reasonableness. We're seeing states and agencies now setting policies higher than Graham versus Garner and making it almost a necessary standard as opposed to reasonable. So your agency can do it. Why they do it, I don't know. It may be something you want to look into further, but state agencies are allowed to make their policies more difficult than what the U.S. Supreme Court says. Again, that's just the floor. You can go above it and make it more stringent.
Okay, I see Doug's hand is still up, but I'm sure he's probably had his answer already. Doug, you okay?
I had one up there talking about, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, let me throw it out here. From a trainer's point of view, and this is what I see across the country, because I'm still very active in training, and a lot of departments will train to their policy, which is the verbal out, usually on a like a typical certification. They want that verbal out. However, about 99% of the real bites are all tactical or hard outs, and really they're a hard out. There's nothing tactical about it, my opinion. The problem with that analogy and the way that a canine works, if that dog recognizes that search picture, that scent picture, as always being a hard out on the street, this is going to cause a hardness of the dog, which is really going to be hard to change into that verbal out. What I'm trying to say is they're never going to have a clean verbal out in the street, because they've never been compelled to do that. And then this causes the length of bites, the length of time on the bites, going way beyond compliance, where the dog is on a bite for like 30, 40 seconds, a minute. I mean, just totally unacceptable. I mean, you brought it up, Scott, there in your talk about that's exactly what I teach in my classes. If a person is complying and the dog is still on him, it's like hitting him with a baton constantly, or continuing to use that taser on him as he's trying to surrender, and we have 4 cops taking him into custody. These things just look so bad, they're not going to work anymore. And I think we need to I think the industry as a whole needs to get a hold of that, because it's causing us a big problem.
I will agree with that. As an expert also, I run into that. And there are cases that come up where the handler is on video with a hard out or a tactical out, and making sure that we're all on the same page. This is where the dog is, or the handler is lifting the dog up, trying to choke him off of the bite while the guy still is attached to the dog's mouth. And what that does, it becomes excessive, I believe, and it leads to more damage. And there's actually some cases that's where the lawsuit started. So I agree with you 100%. We have to do this. Sometimes I think some of this is being trained in different places before the handler even hits the street, and yes, they don't recognize that what they're learning is not going to be acceptable on the street, or it is a training technique during a class that carries on to when they go on the street. And the handler needs to have as much information from one of those classes as the dog does. So it's a learning process on both. Go ahead, Steve.
Doug brings up a really good point, is dogs they don't have the capacity for rational thought. They can't extrapolate. They are masters of association, and their behavior is controlled by antecedents and consequences. And the antecedents in a real world deployment are different than they are in training. You can never, ever replicate real world antecedents in training. You can simulate them, You can get your best approximation, but you can't get them there. And because of this, I say the answer to this dilemma is not an either or, but it's a both and. That you don't throw away what people will call a hard out. I'll call a tactile cued out. I don't like the idea of calling it a tactical out, because I agree with you. It's anything but in many circumstances, but there is a place for it in certain circumstances. You should have both tools in your toolkit. I don't want to throw anything out, because there are very dangerous suspects that it's perfectly appropriate to leave that dog there for a second, have the handler get physical control while you have your team converge on that person at the same time, and they go ahead and take them up. That may be a circumstance where you need that. Otherwise, you continue to work on the verbal out and understand that in real world circumstances with dogs fighting real suspects, sometimes they will go through the same sensory exclusion that force science has taught us human beings go through, and that you have to go ahead and have contingencies in place that you know that you will do. You don't want to have things going that long. I know, I've witnessed, I've seen it where we've taken steps to correct it. These are lessons you learn through painful experience. Doug may not remember me, but I remember around you from the days of Ryan and Yarnell and those guys. And you guys came up and helped us with our first ACLU battle in the 1990s, back during the old Canine Wars. And one of the things that I think we can both say is this industry has evolved since then, but it's evolving in pockets. And, you see some places moving in one direction or another. And in a way, that's good, because eventually superior tactics are going to find their way to the top and things will get better. Superior training techniques will find their way to the top and everything will get better. But that means those who haven't been going in that direction are going to feel some pain along the way. And the whole point of these conversations, these webinars, is to see if we can share the knowledge, the pain that we've had in the past, and help everybody move together in a way that, again, raises all boats. And one of the ways to do that is to take the input from guys like Doug about this and say, look, here's a problem, we see it. Okay, now, how do we address it? And the answer is always going to be, it depends. And you're going to have to find ways to train so that you're ready for contingencies, things that don't happen the way you predict them to.
Yeah, am I still on?
Yes.
Yeah, and Don, you bring up something Gino pulled from you the last time I heard you speak, was in some respects you made the comment like, I don't know where we're going here, we're going backwards sometimes. And Don, to your point, you hit it on the head. There's so many different pockets of so-called experts out there training. And I think one way to alleviate it for the folks that are on this feed here is to actually not just willy-nilly send their folks to outside training unless they really get an idea of what they're teaching. Because I think a lot of times departments, higher ups, they don't look at that. They just look at, we need to get our guys some training no matter what it is, good, bad, or indifferent, and they just send them off, not paying attention to that. And that's where you're getting all these different pockets of training. They're training outside policy, and that's a problem. Mm-hmm. They hit the street, and that's what you got. So,
if I can jump in on that, here's one of the things where I see when you send to an outside trainer, and particularly a trainer that is providing dogs for a variety of different agencies in an area, all of which may have slightly different policies. So the question is when they get together to train, that trainer is going to do what's going to work because of the economies of scale that he or she needs to get that many dogs done in a day or whatever, or an evening, or however long that time period is. They will by default train to the lowest common denominator. When you send your dogs even to a good canine seminar for a national organization, a state organization, or a regional organization, that training generally will be to the lowest common denominator. They may have a lofty goal, but they realize that they can't not everybody's coming in there prepared for where that lofty goal is. And if you get one or two dogs perform to where you hope it is, you hope that there will be an example for everybody else. But all the other people are still getting reps in that aren't quite there. It's not that you don't want to send them to these seminars. You want to send them, but you have to go ahead and then temper that information and figure out what can we take from this and extract and apply it in our policy, within the scope of our policy and our tactics.
Good point.
And I'll I will always advocate for sending people to outside training as long as you vet it, and as long as soon as they get back, you look at it, you say, what are we doing? How do we take this? How do we tweak it? Do we want to add this to our toolkit, or do we say it's not quite right for us, or do we tweak it and we go back to them and say, hey, look what we did with what you gave us? You know, get excited about the possibilities, but always keep your goals in mind.
Right, I agree. Good point.
Hey, Steve, let me follow up on that. That touches also on, reverting back a little bit to the policy discussion, the organizational leadership structure that's in place. So you have a very strong system in place where you oversee what's coming in, garbage in, garbage out, and you don't let garbage in. It doesn't make it to the street. It doesn't make it into formal training. A lot of agencies, again, this is another reason why this is kind of another topic, but agencies have to be careful who's leading them. And I don't mean agencies, I mean leadership and the county council and the city council and, you know, the state. Because if you have a supervisor in charge, and I think everyone would agree, that has no interest in canine, and you have a lieutenant that's not there, so this guy might be the acting lieutenant over traffic and he's overseeing canine, you're not going to have that kind of filter, that system. So you could have handlers, you have this informal structure where you have handlers bringing in all this Navy SEAL training and, you know, training from, you know, wherever, and bringing it in, and it makes it to the street, and there is no filter, that no one to take a look at it and make sure it comports with, you know, the standards of the agency and the government entity and such. So, or even worse, you have 5 handlers, you have 3 different ways of training, or 3 different tactics that are used in one thing, where we watched training one day and there was 5 handlers and they all had a whole different way of doing whatever that they had learned from some other place. There was no consistency of training even among themselves, much less like in a region. So that touches on the importance of effective leadership as well.
Thank you, everyone. I think it's getting to be time to close her up. Appreciate everyone. Thank you so much, instructors. I appreciate it.